Wonderful. Thank you, Alexis, for dialing us all in and getting the glitches worked out. And thank you, Mark Finley. This is a real pleasure to have you with us again. And as Alexis mentioned, Mark is going to share one piece of a much broader global analysis that BP does. And Mark is indeed the general manager of global energy markets, and he's had this job for according to the CV, 14 years, and in this role has directed BP's long-term and short-term analysis of global oil markets, and he manages the annual production of BP's Statistical Review of World Energy, which I wanted to mention is in its 60th year. So, but we're glad that in the second year of having Mark join us to share the North America outlook slice of that. And for those of you who were with us last week in Mexico City, the role of natural gas was a huge part of the discussion. And obviously, as Mexico deals with its reforms, a lot of the bet is on the replacement of fuel oil by natural gas and expansion of the role of gas. Last year, Mark talked about the rise in natural gas in North America in terms of our energy mix, and also a spike in renewables. And so I think with what's happened over the last several months, we're really eager to get the update and the renewed analysis in terms of the trends for North America. Will renewables continue to spike? Is natural gas still the largest growing segment in our fuel mix, our energy mix? And so I don't really want to belabor the introduction because Mark's got all the numbers and the details to share with us. I'm just looking forward to learning how BP's analysis dealt with the last 9 months and the future. And as one person always says, you have to expect the unexpected, and I know they do in their analysis. So, Mark, over to you, and thanks for joining us to share your insights again this year.
Jeremy, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thanks to you and Alexis for extending the invitation and giving me the opportunity to share BP's perspectives with the members and friends of the Institute, and it's great to be back, so thank you again. What I'm going to share today is the North American focused story that emerges from our global annual energy outlook, as you've mentioned, and a bit of background on the energy outlook before I go into it. First of all, what we are seeking to portray in the energy outlook every year is our best view of what we think is most likely to happen for the North American and the global energy system based on expected changes in economic growth and population, but also policy and the evolution of technology. And so it's important to recognize from the outset that it's not the world as we wish it would be, but rather our best effort as analysts to be as objective as we can be and to describe what we think is most likely to happen. Now, we recognize, of course, that anytime you're trying to look 20 more years out into the future, your confidence in your ability to project a most likely path is pretty low. And so we do delve into some of the key uncertainties as well. And by the way, I should note, I've listed the website here on our cover slide, and my objective today is to whet your members' appetite and encourage you to go and look at the broader detail that's in our global and North American energy outlooks, which are both available online at the web address that's given. May I have the next slide, please? Just by way of a very brief overview, our agenda for today is that we will begin with a review of North American regional energy trends in our outlook. Then we will review the data fuel by fuel, and then move on to a discussion of some of the key uncertainties around this outlook. And hopefully we can do all of that and still leave plenty of time for discussion. So next slide, please. On the next slide, what I'm sharing with you is just the background assumptions that frame our outlook with regard to North America's growth in population and GDP. Modest growth in the North American population, as you can see, in average, or in total, it grows by about 18% between now and 2035. In the center panel, we review our assumptions for economic growth. Inflation-adjusted economy of North America grows by 70% over the course of this outlook. And again, you see the distribution there. By the way, you can see that the U.S. portion is much bigger because, of course, the U.S. economy is much bigger, but the growth rate is actually more rapid in Canada and Mexico, which we will treat as a combined group of countries for the purposes of this discussion. And on the far right, again, we're showing you that Some of the growth in the economy in North America comes from rising population, but the vast majority of the growth actually comes from improved efficiency and growth of per capita income. Now, this, of course, translates into the energy picture, but not quite in a direct fashion. So may I have the next slide, please? Even though North America's economy grows by 70%, we are projecting that North American demand for energy is essentially flat over the course of this outlook. In fact, total energy demand in North America grows by just 5%, and what little growth there is in Canada and Mexico. U.S. energy consumption is almost completely flat over the course of the outlook. It grows by 1%, and in fact, it begins to decline after about 2025. And these are due to a combination of factors, including the relative maturity of the North American economy, but also consumers reacting to the higher energy prices that we've seen in recent years, and as we will see, government policies that push for significant improvements in the efficiency of energy use. May I have the next slide, please? On this next slide, I'm repeating the picture of our forecast for energy consumption, but I'm slicing it different ways for perspective. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you the profile for energy consumption by sector, and on the right by fuel. So first, on the left-hand side, within that profile of sluggish growth of overall energy consumption, there are changes within the mix, obviously. We project that energy consumed in transportation at the bottom of that picture will actually decline by 9%. The most rapid growth in percentage and in absolute terms will be at the very top of the chart, other. In other words, energy consumed largely in buildings, in residential and commercial applications. On the right-hand side, we review the details fuel by fuel. We project significant declines in the consumption of both coal and oil in North America, offset by growth in natural gas consumption, and the fastest growing group of fuels by far are at the very top of that chart, renewable forms of energy, which more than double over the course of this outlook, growing at more than 5% per year, again, at a time when overall energy consumption is essentially flat. May I have the next slide, please? This slide reviews the outlook, the shares of energy consumption in North America on the left-hand panel and the contributions to the change on the right. So on the left-hand side, today, oil is the dominant fuel in North America, as it has been for the last more than 50 years now. But you can see that in our outlook, with declining consumption of oil and rising consumption of natural gas will replace oil as North America's dominant fuel. Elsewhere in the mix, we see a significant loss of market share for coal and dramatic growth in renewable forms of energy, which by the end of our outlook will more than triple their share, albeit from a small base, growing to about 10% of the global energy mix. Now, clearly from this picture, you can see that this is still a world, even though renewables are the fastest growing group of fuels by far, and by the way, when I refer to renewable energy, I'm referring to commercial forms of renewable energy, so wind, solar, geothermal energy in power generation, as well as biofuels in transportation. Even though renewables are the most rapidly growing group of fuels, this is still an outlook in which the energy mix in North America is dominated by fossil fuels. Today, fossil fuels account for 83% of the North American energy mix. They do lose market share because of the rapid growth of renewables, but they still account for 78% of North American energy consumption, even by 2035. And I should mention, by the way, that this is even with an assumption that renewable forms of energy achieve significant economies of scale and become more competitive. And we believe that there will be continued adoption of policies that will be aimed at enhancing the growth and incentivizing the growth of renewable energy, in particular at the expense of coal, and we'll come back to that later. On the right-hand side, we're just showing you the contributions to the total changes between now and 2035. Overall energy consumption is essentially flat in the United States, but significant changes in the mix with rapid growth of natural gas and renewables, and losing consumption for oil and for coal, and a bit of nuclear, and we'll come back to that. In Canada and Mexico, the growth of energy is predominantly through the growth of natural gas consumption. Next slide, please. Now, earlier when I reviewed the data by sector of the economy, what I didn't show you was power, and that was because I was showing you final consumption. But behind the scenes, power is actually the driver of what little growth there is of energy consumption in North America. On the left-hand panel, I'm simply showing you the share of total energy consumption in North America that is used for generating electricity. It has risen very strongly in the last 50 years and rises very slightly in the next 20 years. Largely, the process of electrification is complete, and there are significant policies aimed at using electricity more efficiently in our outlook. On the right, by the way, so renewable energy power generation rather accounts for 70% of all of the growth in North American energy consumption in our outlook. On the right-hand panel, I'm showing you where the power comes from. And you can see significant changes over time in our outlook. Coal is the big loser, losing with its share of power generation going from just under 40% today to less than 20% by 2035. And this is due to a combination of government policies that we're already seeing being implemented, certainly here in the United States, that are aimed at reducing the importance of coal in the energy mix, as well as the increasing competitiveness of natural gas due to the shale revolution and renewable energy, and again, we'll come back to that. The big winners in terms of market share in our outlook for power generation are at the top, natural gas and renewable forms of energy. In total, carbon-free sources of power generation, that is nuclear power, hydroelectricity, and renewable energy, grow from 38% of North America's power generation today to 48%, just under half, by 2035. Now, next slide, please. All of this has implications for CO2 emissions. On the left-hand panel of this chart, I'm showing you, again, based on from 1990 as the reference point, cumulative changes in our outlook for the economy of North America, for energy consumption, and for CO2 emissions. We've already covered the first two of those. North America's economy grows by 70%. Energy consumption in North America grows by 5% by 2035. In our outlook, North American CO2 emissions decline slightly by 9%. That's because the fuels that are gaining market share in our outlook are the low-carbon forms of energy, renewable energy, and natural gas. Now, the obvious question looking at this chart is, why do we see a huge gap emerge between GDP and energy? And why do we not see a huge gap emerging between energy and CO2 emissions? So let me take them in turn. First, we do see a huge gap opening between energy and GDP. In fact, we believe that North America will become 39% less energy intensive over the forecast interval. And why do we see that rapid growth? Well, there are clearly policies that are pushing for greater efficiency of energy use, but the other factor is simple, and I'm sure many of you understand it from your own business experiences, or the experience of running your family business, if it were. Energy is expensive, and there is already a tremendous incentive to use it more efficiently. Why do we not see a similar gap opening between energy and CO2? The simple fact of the matter is that, presently, and if CO2 is not expensive. And so we don't have a tremendous incentive built into the system to reduce the carbon content of the energy mix. And in fact, on the right-hand panel, you can see that, if we were to allow emissions to grow based on just the growth of the economy and the current relationship between energy and economic activity, we would see a significant increase in North American CO2 emissions. And the reasons why we see a decline instead are primarily due to that significant improvement of energy intensity. What it suggests, by the way, to me, is that, when the time comes for more concerted action to deal with the challenge of climate, it's likely to be the case that the low-hanging fruit is on the part that is not on that chart. It's the fuel mix, because that's what people haven't yet focused their creative energies on. We'll come back to CO2 emissions and climate at the end of the discussion. I have the next slide, please. So far, all we've done is talk about demand, but because I'm an economist, I have to talk about supply and demand together. So this chart addresses the drivers of North American energy production. On the left-hand side, I'm simply showing you total production of energy, which in our data, North American energy production grows by 1/3 over the forecast interval. All of that net growth is due to the four factors on the right-hand side of this chart. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess that this will probably be the only chart you'll ever see that has renewable energy, biofuels included, shale, and Canadian oil sands all on the same chart with the same theme. But there is a common theme. In fact, two. The first theme is that none of these were a material part of the energy mix 20 years ago. All of them are growing rapidly, driven by technology and innovation that has been fostered by reactions to higher fossil fuel prices in recent years and facilitated in each case by constructive government policy. These forms of energy now account for about 20% of North America's energy production. I mentioned earlier they account for all of the net growth in North American energy production in our forecast. And by the end of the forecast interval, just these forms of energy alone will account for 45% of all of North America's energy production. May I have the next chart, please? I'd like to spend a bit more time looking at one of those dimensions in more detail, and that is the shale revolution. I'm sure many of you are well familiar with it. The panel on the left-hand side of this chart shows technically recoverable shale resources around the world. And you can see that North America is not unique in having shale resources below the ground. In fact, on these estimates of technically recoverable resources, North America has about 23%, or just less than a quarter, of the global total. And yet, today, 100% of the production of these resources is in North America. By 2035, North America continues to dominate. While we do see material contributions of production of shale gas and tight oil, a related concept to shale with a slightly broader categorization, we do expect to see material contributions from outside of North America, but even by 2035, North America will continue to dominate global production. The panel on the right shows you that, in our outlook, cumulative production between now and 2035 of shale gas and tight oil, North America accounts for 87% of the total. And even by 2035 will account for something like 3/4 of the total. So why does North America dominate? Obviously, it's not what's in the ground that is the determining factor, because you can see on the left-hand panel that North America doesn't look anything special on that regard. It's what's obviously above the ground that matters and not below the ground. Let's explore some of this in more detail. On the next slide, please. So just to put these numbers in perspective, on the left-hand panel, I'm showing you that the growth of U.S. oil production last year, driven fundamentally by the shale revolution, was the fourth biggest increase in oil production in the history of the planet. By far the biggest increase in U.S. history, going all the way back to Colonel Drake at Titusville, Pennsylvania in the 1850s, but only Saudi Arabia has ever had a bigger one-year increase in oil production than the U.S. did last year. By the way, U.S. production last year grew twice as fast as global consumption of oil. So it's not surprising that the oil market has become oversupplied and prices have declined over the last 9 months or so. One of the key drivers of that rapid growth of production is shown on the right-hand side of this chart, which is rapid productivity growth. In fact, in the last 7 years, the average productivity of shale wells in the United States for oil has grown by 34% a year. For gas, it's grown by 10% a year. And these dramatic improvements in productivity have helped to facilitate the rapid growth of production in the United States. We, by the way, explore the shale dynamic and the market ramifications of it in more detail in the global version of our outlook, and I'm happy to come back to that during the discussion period. May I have the next slide, please? So all of these changes in North American energy production and consumption have significant ramifications for global energy balances. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you regional balances, and the way to read this chart is regions above zero are net exporters of energy. Regions below zero are net importers of energy. You know that North America has already been in the process of reducing its net import dependence, and with the rapid growth of production and modest growth of consumption that I've described already, North America actually transitions to being a significant net exporter of energy, and in fact will account for nearly 20% of global net energy exports by 2035. All of the growth in imports of energy in our outlook go to Asia, and this portends a significant shift in the world of energy. For those of us who've been around a while, grew up in a world where oil or in energy more broadly flowed east to west. It was produced, for example, with oil in the Middle East and then shipped west to hungry consuming markets in Europe and in North America. North America is already, as we've discussed, in the process of becoming a net exporter. European net import dependence is relatively stable, and increasingly energy flows will go west to east in our outlook instead. The ramifications of that by fuel are shown on the right-hand side of this chart. North America today is a small net exporter of coal, roughly self-sufficient in natural gas, and still a significant net importer of oil, although reducing dramatically. And you can see that in all three cases, North America becomes a significant net exporter of oil, gas, and coal in the later years of our forecast. I'll now move into a review of the data fuel by fuel. May I move please to slide 14? And we'll begin our discussion of oil. And by the way, you will notice that we've switched units here. We are no longer talking about tons of oil equivalent, which is our basis for comparing between fuels. We're now talking millions of barrels per day, which is, of course, the convention for talking about oil. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you the sectoral profile for North American oil demand, which declines in our outlook by about 2 million barrels a day to the lowest level since 1995. All of that decline is concentrated in the U.S. in the transport sector, and we'll come back to that shortly. On the supply side, significant growth of production, growing by 9 million barrels a day. While it's not shown on the chart, about two-thirds of that growth is in the U.S. and about one-third is in Canada. The biggest individual contributors are shown on the right-hand side. Continued growth of tight oil, although you can see that that begins to plateau in the later years of our outlook. Significant growth in production of natural gas liquids that are associated with shale, and continued rapid, robust growth of Canadian oil sands production as well. And that's more than enough to offset declining conventional production in North America. And as you can see by the relative scales, by 2035, supply is bigger than demand. In other words, North America becomes a significant net exporter of oil. May I have the next slide, please? I mentioned the decline in consumption in the transport sector, and we go into that in a bit more detail on slide 15, please. My screen seems to have frozen, but I hope that we're keeping up. There we go. So we have transport sector energy consumption declining. It's not because people stop driving. You can see on the left-hand side, the vehicle fleet in North America grows by 27%. Rather, what's really driving it, pun intended, is the center panel, a dramatic improvement in the fuel efficiency of new cars. In, for example, the United States, fuel efficiency grows by almost 4% annually, driven by a combination of consumers reacting to higher prices at the pump that we've seen in recent years by demanding more fuel-efficient vehicles, but also, especially in the later years of our forecast, by government policies that push for much greater improvements in fuel efficiency. The ramifications of that are on the right-hand side. I mentioned already, demand in the transport sector falls by 9%. But this is an important, I think, an interesting observation. We survey the technology landscape in transport every year, and we array by their relative costs all of the different technology options, including electric battery vehicles, natural gas, and what comes back every year as we survey the technology options as the most cost-effective solution is to make the internal combustion engine more fuel efficient. And so while we see significant improvements of fuel efficiency, this is still a sector that is dominated by oil, which continues to account for 87% of all the energy consumed in the transport sector by 2035. Now, to be fair, that is a reduction from what it is now, and we do have significant growth of both biofuels and a bit of natural gas coming into the transport sector. May I have the next slide, please? The only other place where oil consumption grows in the North American economy is in petrochemicals, the green line on the left-hand panel. Oil consumption everywhere else declines. And the reason for this is primarily, one of the key drivers of it, let me put it that way, is the shale revolution. And in particular, in this context, rapid growth of production of natural gas liquids, that is to say, liquids associated with the production of natural gas, which just happened to turn out to be a very effective feedstock for petrochemicals. And you can see, again, driven by the shale revolution, we have significant growth in the production of these natural gas liquids in North America in our outlook. May I have the next slide, please? So, similar to the story for energy overall, our outlook has ramifications for global trade in oil. And again, the pattern of the left-hand chart, I hope is familiar at this point. Regions above the line are the oil exporters of the world. Regions below the line are the importers. 100% of the growth of imports in our outlook go to Asia. North America becomes a net exporter of oil in the next few years, and in fact accounts for 15% of the global trade by 2035. Middle East remains the biggest exporting region, but actually loses market share in our outlook. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you the implications for import dependence of our outlook for the biggest consumers of oil in the world today. The United States last year was passed by China as the biggest importer of oil in the world, and as you can see, the trend lines are going in the opposite direction. The U.S. has already cut its import dependence in half in the last decade, reducing the need for internationally traded oil by about 6 million barrels a day over that period. A huge swing. China, on our trajectory, is set to be not only become the biggest importer in the world, but in terms of both the level of oil imported and as a share of consumption, is trending toward a degree of import dependence that is more than anything the United States has ever experienced. India is on a similar pathway with a lag, and by 2035, we're projecting that the United States actually becomes self-sufficient in oil. Next, I'd like to turn to natural gas. May I have the next slide, please? I mentioned that natural gas is the only fossil fuel that sees demand growing in North America, and here's the data. In fact, it pretty much grows everywhere. It grows in power generation, it grows in industry. In fact, gas in power generation in North America grows by almost 60%. Gas consumed in industry grows by more than 25%, and total consumption of natural gas in North America grows by 33%. Production grows even more rapidly, grows by nearly 60%. And once again, you can see, in total, production is bigger than consumption. That is to say, North America becomes a significant net exporter. All of the net growth in production in North America comes from shale, which grows from about 1/3 of production today to about 60% of total production by 2035, mostly in the United States, but with a significant contribution from Canada and Mexico in the later years of our outlook. And that's more than enough to offset modest declines in conventional production in North America. May I have the next slide, please? Once again, the ramifications of this for trade today, and again, hopefully the pattern of the chart on the left is familiar at this point. North America is essentially self-sufficient in natural gas today, sees its exports rise significantly. In fact, by 2035, the United States is the second biggest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world, behind only Australia. Global trade in natural gas more than doubles by 2035 in our outlook, and once again, with the biggest share of that going to Asia. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you the dynamics of how the North American gas market evolved. I mentioned significant growth of production. About 2/3 of that growth of production will be consumed at home in North America, and about 1/3 of it will be exported internationally via liquefied natural gas shipments. May I have the next slide, please, which reviews the data for coal and for all of the non-fossil forms of energy together. I mentioned already that we expect to see significant declines in coal. The point of the chart on the left is to show you there's only one place where coal is really consumed at scale in North America, and that's for power generation in the United States. So not surprisingly, that's where the decline in coal consumption is concentrated in our outlook, for the reasons we discussed earlier. On the right-hand side, we're showing you that the growth in the consumption and production of non-fossil forms of energy essentially offsets the declines in coal. Renewable forms of energy in power generation grow by more than 150%. Wind is the biggest of those, although the growth rate in percentage terms is more rapid for solar. We do see significant growth as well in biofuels production and consumption. And you can also see on this chart at the very bottom, nuclear energy is essentially flat for most of our forecast, but then declines at the very end. In total, it declines by 13% in our forecast. And that decline at the end is driven by a view that at some point, the safe operating lives of these nuclear reactors can no longer be assured, and we will begin to see significant retirements of older nuclear power plants in the later years of our forecast. May I have the next slide, please? Again, that concludes the presentation of the most likely trajectory. But again, recognizing that there are significant uncertainties to our outlook, we want to wrap up with a few concluding thoughts. So first, on CO2. This chart shows you on the left-hand panel our projections for CO2 emissions for the world and for North America with that little wedge way down at the bottom. I've already mentioned that North American CO2 emissions fall by 9%, but energy consumption and CO2 continue to grow for the world as a whole, driven by continued robust growth in the emerging economies in particular. Global CO2 emissions grow by 25%, and as a result, North America's share of the global total falls from 20% currently to 15%. But who cares, because it's a global problem. And the global problem is illustrated by the red line, which is what climate scientists say is a representative path for what global emissions should look like if we were to stabilize global emissions at 450, or atmospheric concentrations of CO2 at 450 parts per million. So we asked ourselves, well, what are options for reducing the CO2 emissions in our outlook? On the right-hand side of this outlook, we're showing you a range of options. Let me be very clear up front. This is not a list of BP advocacy for policy. Rather, this is us as analysts saying, what are some things that we could think of that would, these are different steps that would yield equivalent reductions in CO2. So, for example, a 1% global switch in power generation, if you switched 1% of the world's power generation away from coal and toward natural gas, that would be equivalent to growing all of the renewables in power generation by 11%. Just an illustration of the relative scale of these different phenomena. Now, a couple of thoughts, though, coming from this. If you look through this list, you'll see there are some things listed here that are aimed at reducing the carbon content of the world's energy mix. There are some things aimed at using energy more efficiently. And then, of course, we have an item on carbon capture from power generation as well. Here's the kicker. Each of those options listed on the right would reduce CO2 emissions based on today's energy mix by about 100 million tons. Look back at that left panel. The gap between what we're projecting for global emissions in 2035 and the 450 scenario is 18 billion tons. In other words, you'd need 180 of these policy options on the right-hand side to close the gap. And the question is, who picks? Who has confidence in their ability to pick which of these options might, ahead of time, actually pan out and be effective? We economists get a bad rap. Our management tease us and say if you get 10 economists in a room, you get 11 opinions. I can report, having gone through the exercise of building this scenario, that if you get 10 technology experts in the room, you'll similarly get 11 opinions. It's hard to pick winners ahead of time. And so these observations, when we wrap them together and we say, well, you need a lot of different solutions. There's no magic wand. There's no single option that will fix the climate challenge. And it's difficult ahead of time to pick winners, suggests to us that the efficient policy is to put a global price on carbon and to let the competition play out and let the market results drive a low-cost solution here. Next slide, please. Another important variable that we've tried to consider as we put our energy outlook together is heightened geopolitical risk perceptions. And we go into this in some more detail in the main body of our outlook in the global edition, looking at, for example, oil supply disruptions. By many measures, international perceptions of heightened geopolitical risk have increased in recent years. And I think, we've tried to build some reactions into our base case outlook, but it's, I think, important for us to recognize that faced with perceptions of geopolitical risk, countries can make strategic choices that will matter for the energy balance. And I'm just showing you a couple of examples. The example of building the Alaska oil pipeline and producing oil from Prudhoe Bay in the aftermath of the oil shocks of the 70s. Similarly, a decision in France after the oil shocks of the 1970s to say, we're going to go with nuclear power. In a different context, 20 years later, China, after struggling for many years to remain self-sufficient in oil, reached a strategic conclusion to go ahead and become import dependent, and within 20 years has gone from being self-sufficient to being the biggest importer of oil in the world. So we know strategic choices can matter, and it's important that we as analysts stay attuned to them and to the risks that they pose to our outlook. Final slide, and may I wrap up, please? And hopefully we've left time for discussion. So I don't know if you've been paying attention, but for the last couple of years, the price of oil was not only very high, but it was actually historically stable. The price of oil averaged around $110 a barrel from 2011 all the way through to the middle of 2014. That was the most stable period for oil prices in the modern era in percentage terms. But we know that life actually isn't that stable or that predictable. And, the world is going to change, and we've built continuous change into this outlook. Changes in the way people produce and consume energy, changes in the way people trade energy. One thing you could argue, I think, based on our outlook, is that we don't have enough change when it comes to CO2 emissions and carbon. But again, I think this is why we have to do our best to understand what we think is likely to happen, as well as some of the key uncertainties. With that, let me wrap up. The final slide, I think, just reiterates our web address and leave some space for Q&A. With that, why don't I wrap up? Thank you very much. And Jeremy and Alexis, if you want to moderate Q&A, I'm all yours.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mark. There's a lot of material, wonderful presentation of an immense amount of information in a short period of time. Just a quick reminder, as Alexis noted at the outset, on your toolbar on the right-hand side, you'll see a question mark next to a little silhouette of a person. Use that. That's what we're going to use for the questions, and we'll have a discussion with Mark, and I will drag these up on the screen and read them out. That's how we want to do it, so pop your questions in there. Let me go ahead and start, though, because, Mark, I want to ask you something and see if you can elaborate a little bit on some things you obviously talked about, but I want to get into a little bit more detail. And you made a joke about 10 economists being in the room with 11 ideas and 10 technologists with 11 ideas. So let me ask you, the economist, about the role of technology, and particularly if you could elaborate on how you and how the assumptions of the study and the analysis handle technology, given the timeline of this analysis.
Sure. Yeah, and thanks for the question, Jeremy. The significant evolution of technology is a critical part of our outlook, and so we work very hard to stay in touch not only with BP's technology experts, but technology experts all over the world to come up with a view of how technology is likely to evolve based on our understanding of each of these discrete bits of technology. So, for example, we have significant evolution in, as I mentioned, the fuel efficiency of new cars that are being sold. We also have continued assumptions about the improvement of the efficiency of operations in shale drilling, like we showed. But you have to admit a couple of things. One, you can't predict breakthroughs. You can't predict revolutionary technology. And so while we don't try, I think it's important that we acknowledge that it could be a significant game changer. And so, for example, we don't have a lot of electric vehicles in our outlook, but if there were to be a battery revolution that would significantly improve the efficiency of the battery or reduce its cost, you could see significantly different implications for energy consumed in the transport sector. And by the way, I think I would talk about policy in actually a very similar way. That we consult with policy experts around the world and try to come up with what we think is most likely to change in terms of government policies. But we have to acknowledge that policy changes could be a significant wild card in this outlook. and climate, of course, being only one example.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I imagine the assumptions have to be fairly flexible. Here's an interesting question. Hopefully you can see it, but I'll read it out loud. The question is, how about the exchange of energy sources within North America? Any thoughts on that, Mark?
So, one of the things that we do not do in our outlook is project specific bilateral trade relationships. And the reason for it is it gets to be a very complex exercise, and frankly, the oil and increasingly over time natural gas and coal markets are increasingly global in nature. So, for example, we also make no specific assumptions about specific projects. So I don't have a specific assumption about a certain politically sensitive pipeline that's proposed, in North America. But, again, our view is that it's a global market, and if the oil doesn't flow, from Canada to the United States, it will flow east or west, and to find outlets, to take advantage of. While oil demand in North America is declining, we have it growing globally, and so there's a global market for these fuels. And we do have a view that while we do take into account project delays and political opposition to the development of these resources and their according infrastructure, we also have a view that these are also global markets, and that supply will find its way to demand.
If you don't mind, let me ask you a question that may fall outside of this, but I'm just curious if you can give some thoughts. In one of the slides, you looked at Mexico and Canada together in terms of shale production, and I think I remember you said it comes online in terms of production around 2020. But my question is, given some of the latest situation in potential delays and postponement of bidding in Mexico, how does that impact that 2020 production timeline for shale?
Right. Well, the answer is we haven't assessed things that have happened recently. I mean, the outlook was published in February, and the data was actually closed out before the end of the year. And so, in the case of the recent news out of Mexico, we haven't had the opportunity to assess it. I would say, let me stand back a bit and say, we recognize that these are decisions to be made by the Mexican people and their elected representatives. We do assume that over time, these reforms will advance. And in fact, I would say that since, in the current edition of our outlook relative to the previous year, we advanced the timeline for those assumptions based on, the progress that we had seen over the course of the end of 2013 and into the, 2014. And so, again, we're trying to think long term, and recognize that these things will take time to fully come to fruition, to have the policy implemented and the regulatory framework put into place, and to get the bids out, and to get the investment in place, and that's all reflected in the outlook.
Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot like that, but I thought it was a decent follow. Let's talk a little bit about a specific question here on carbon. And the question is, have you analyzed the price of carbon that would close the 180 billion ton gap between forecasted 2035 carbon emissions and the IEA 450 path?
Let me just clarify, it's 18 billion tons, not 180 billion for the world as a whole, but that's still too much. The answer is no, because we don't have the space to do these hypotheticals. What I can say is, we have the equivalent of a carbon price of about $40 a ton built into the policy assumptions that we've adopted for this outlook, at least for the North American and other mature economies of the OECD. And in fact, BP has stated in public before that we actually apply a $40 a ton carbon price when we're evaluating investments in these countries. So clearly, $40 a ton in the OECD countries, or the equivalent of that, sits behind the black line on that chart, which is our baseline projection for CO2 emissions. So clearly, $40 isn't enough. But we have not assessed how much of a carbon price would be needed to close it.
Okay, and just thanks for the clarification. So the gap is 18 billion tons, just to be clear on that.
Right.
Let's. Somebody has a question about China, and let me put that up here. And I think the idea is the question is how about exchange of energy sources within China? And I think what the allusion here is what's happening with the Chinese market. And obviously, you talked about China's trend in terms of importation and surpassing the United States as the world's largest consumer. So maybe a little bit more detail on energy in China and where it fits in your analysis, which of course is a little bit more on the global side.
Of course, and that's entirely fair game. And we do go into that in more detail in the global edition of our Outlook. China, of course, is the key driver of our global energy outlook. And within that, we actually have a view that over time, the rate of growth of energy and how China's economy interacts with energy will evolve significantly over time. And the stylized view, at a stylized level, China in the last 20 years has seen dramatic economic growth driven by export of energy-intensive heavy industry. And again, at a stylized level, we believe that over time, China's mode of economic development will, A, the growth rates of the economy will begin to slow, but B, that the mode of economic development will shift away from energy-intensive export-led growth and toward more of a focus on the consumption of domestic goods and services, which are less energy-intensive. So the growth rate for energy demand in China moderates significantly. Within that, we also see that China has the biggest growth in the world for the demand of oil and for natural gas and for hydro and for nuclear and for renewable energy. And that as a result of all of those, China, the growth rate of coal consumption in China slows significantly and in fact begins to plateau in the later years of our outlook. But B, China becomes significantly more import dependent not only on oil, but also on natural gas. And believe it or not, for coal to a lesser degree as well.
Well, I'd love to talk more about that. So let me move on to some of the other questions we have getting into the renewable space. And there's a question here about, I think an interesting question about BP's portfolio, specifically looking at the energy forecast and the rapid growth of renewable energy in the years to come. How much of BP's portfolio will consist of renewables by 2035?
I'm not really the person to ask about internal BP stuff because my job is to look outside rather than inside. But let me offer a few thoughts. BP today is one of the biggest producers of wind power in the United States. We have about 1,000 wind turbines here in the U.S. We're also a significant player in biofuels, both traditional sugarcane-based ethanol in Brazil, as well as doing basic research in the development of next-generation biofuels. But like everything, as for everything else, just because something is growing rapidly doesn't mean that there's a business opportunity for us in there. And the trick is where do our strengths as a company play into this? So, for example, when I joined BP 15 years ago, BP was the biggest manufacturer of solar panels in the world. We can't compete. It's a manufacturing process. Doesn't play to our strengths as a corporation, and other companies are more efficient at it than we are, and we've exited that business. So, we're always watching the technology horizon, looking for places where we think there's a scalable business, but also one that we can compete in. And those are the kind of factors that drive our thought process.
Excellent. Thanks for taking a stab at that. A quick follow-up that's not so much on BP's portfolio, but rather North America's renewables mix. And within the renewable sector, where do you see the biggest opportunities or areas for growth in North America?
So I think I made a mention of this earlier, but within the North American energy mix, we have significant growth in the production of, well, if I just scale them up, the biggest growth in absolute terms is in wind energy. But if I look at it in terms of growth rates are actually much higher for solar energy. And part of the reason for that is that wind is already bigger, and it's just hard to grow in percentage terms off a bigger base. But also, wind is becoming a relatively mature technology, whereas solar is much less so, and so the opportunities for driving additional costs through maturing the technology and scaling it up seem to be better for solar than for wind. So in absolute terms, the biggest growth is in percentage terms, the biggest is in solar.
Okay, thank you. Couple more questions. I think we've got time for at least 2 or 3 more. There's somebody who wants to ask about electric vehicles. And the question is that they were surprised at your forecast for electric vehicle contribution to the total transportation mix. Could you elaborate?
Yeah. So again, when we do this forecast every year, we array all of the transport options, and we talk not only to our own technology experts, but we go out and we talk to the battery makers and the automakers and the national laboratories, and we put in assumptions about how the cost of these various technologies will evolve over time, and we overlay our policy assumptions, and every year what comes back as the winner is to make the internal combustion engine more fuel efficient. Now, there are a couple of caveats to that. One caveat is that 2035 is not a long-term outlook when it comes to this topic. By the time you think about, you have to develop the battery manufacturing capability, you have to retool the auto assembly lines, you have to start making the cars, then you have to turn over the vehicle fleet. The average vehicle in North America will be on the road for 15 years. So essentially, the cars that people are driving in 2035 are essentially already in development today. By the time you backtrack through all of those processes. And so even on our outlook, if you were to extend it beyond 2035, you would begin to see more electrics later on. And the simple fact is that 2035 is not a long-term forecast when it comes to this. The other key variable, of course, are the cost of fuel, as well as the cost of the battery technology, and the policy assumptions. So, we have not assumed that policymakers are going to say, I don't care what it costs, build batteries, and nothing else. So, these are the vectors of, there's technology uncertainties, there's cost uncertainties, market uncertainties, and policy uncertainties. But as we weigh them in the most likely case, this is where we've come out and why.
And you mentioned when I asked the question about technology, the breakthrough on batteries and storage. So it sounds like that could be the kind of complete shift of this outlook, right? The storage and battery question.
It's clearly an important variable for oil, but I think it's also important to remember that. Let me give you an anecdote. I remember a few years ago hearing, people in the wind business saying, "Oh man, we are really driving costs down. We are so going to be able to compete with $5 natural gas in North America for power generation." But guess what? The wind guys weren't the only ones who were innovating. The gas guys were developing this whole thing called shale technology. And so it's important to remember that technology innovation is important, but everyone is doing it. And you have to not only worry about what you're doing, you have to worry about what your competition is doing as well.
Amen. Let me ask you one more question on some specific numbers, and then I want to end with a policy question. The question here is, what is the non-biofuel share of the 10% renewables in 2035?
I think I had that in one of the charts earlier. It was slide number 20.
All right, so just to see if we
slide number 20 in my pack showed the North American mix there. So the orange is renewables and power generation. The green is biofuels. So you can see I'm just eyeballing it. I have to look up the precise number, but if the orange plus the green is 10% of the North American energy mix, then it must be the case that the renewables and power generation look like they're about 80% of that. By the way, note that the renewables and power generation do include a small amount of biomass. That is to say, stocks that are generated using to generate electricity on a commercial scale, but it's a tiny share of the total.
Excellent. Thank you. As I mentioned, I want to try and end on a policy question. Let me pull that up here, and it's really a U.S. policy question, but it's something you're based in D.C., so I'm sure you deal with this every single day, and it's something we're looking at and talking about here at the La Jolla Energy Conference, May 20th and 21st. And where do the potential policy changes in U.S. crude exports fit in the scenarios?
Okay. We have, for the purposes of this narrative, assumed that at some point, economically rational trade to rebalance the shifting slate of North American crude oil production with the capability of North America's refineries, many of which are not configured to process light, sweet, domestic shale crude oil, is eventually permitted to take place. But that's not an advocacy, and it's recognizing that it's a political uncertainty and a decision still to be made. If I may, Jeremy, I'd like to actually back up a bit and say, there's an amazing story here for North American energy. And I think it's really important for us to recognize why that's happening. I mean, why is shale happening in North America and not elsewhere around the world? We talked about it a little bit earlier. It's what's above the ground and not what's below the ground that matters. It's is there a competitive industry? But is there a framework of private ownership of property and the ability to put capital at risk and capital markets that allow you to access funding and government policies that allow you to risk your capital in the hopes of making money and to keep that money and for investment to take place. And in fact, if we look back and ask ourselves, where have the big innovations taken place in the production of oil and gas in the last 50 years? Producing in Arctic provinces, producing offshore, and producing heavy oil deposits, and producing shale. Every single one of these innovations was developed at scale in North America. Not because North America has unique hydrocarbons in the ground, but because of what's above the ground that's unique. And the policy is a key part of that. And I think, recognizing the role that policy has played in facilitating this energy revolution and the benefits that have flowed to North America from it, and not taking that for granted going forward, I think is an important part of the story.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that step backwards. And I mean, you hinted at, why this has been able to make this history last year in terms of production. And obviously, in other parts of this hemisphere, for example, Argentina, where there is a little bit of production coming online, they're still trying to figure out that question of how to really unleash the below ground potential. And it's clearly the above ground issues that are going to hold that or let it move ahead quickly. It's 12:02, I think, on my clock, or California time, that is. So I want to, and I apologize for any last minute questions that came in. I just want to thank Mark and really appreciate all your time, and thanks for taking on some questions that I know you, as the leader of this analysis and study, may not be completely disposed to respond to, but you did a wonderful job. So thank you so.
Jeremy, I appreciate the invitation. I hope you and your members found this to be a useful contribution. I wish you well with your annual energy conference, and thank you.
Sorry, I think we've just lost Jeremy there. This is Alexis. He's just thanking everybody again. Thank you for being online. Thank you, Mark. It was absolutely fascinating discussion. The presentation will be available later, and hopefully we'll have the recording up tomorrow. And I want to thank everybody for your fantastic questions. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get to all of them. Thank you so much, Mark. Thanks. Until next year, have a wonderful day.
Thanks again, Alexis. Bye-bye.